Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's always great to be in a room with several hundred people that are all passionate about delivering high-quality housing choices for everyone. So thanks for taking the time to be committed to this. Thanks to the Kentucky Housing Corporation for hosting me today as part of their annual Affordable Housing Conference. My presentation today is titled Missing Middle Housing, Thinking Big and Building Small to Respond to the Housing Crisis. So you heard this morning from Patrick and Wendy, based on the housing supply analysis that they did, that there's this tremendous gap between the numbers of housing units the state needs and what has been delivered over the last plus or minus 8 to 10 years. And unfortunately, what we've discovered in our work across the country with cities and in working with developers is there's also a gap between the types of housing that households want and households need and what is being delivered. And so on this diagram, you can see on the left, there's single-family homes, which is a large percent of what gets delivered. And in the far right-hand side are most likely garden apartments in smaller communities or 3, 4, 5+ story apartment buildings in larger communities. And all the types that are missing in between that are what we call missing middle housing, and that's what I will focus on today in my presentation. And so it's really, really important for all of us to have a set of new tools and to create think outside of the box in terms of providing solutions for this dire housing context that we're currently in, and to really rethink not only the way we deliver housing, but also the way that we discuss and frame this conversation. We find this really, really important because this is a little cottage court missing middle housing type. And let's just get a show of hands. How many people feel that you could show a picture of this in the communities you work in and you could fairly easily build some support for the support of this kind of housing? Raise your hand if you think you could use a photo like this to get some support. So what we find is like these imagery and visualization is really important because this little cottage court housing type is actually considered high density by many zoning codes and planning documents. And if you go into a community and say, hey, we're gonna build higher density in your community, or we're gonna build a multifamily project in your community, how many of you feel like that's a good way to frame a conversation about sort of allowing these much needed housing choices in your community, right? That's where you start to get that immediate pushback. And so missing middle, what I'm going to talk about today, I'm hoping it'll arm you with the tools, the communication, the knowledge to be a missing middle champion in your individual communities that you're living in or working in. So I'm going to start off by talking about why this conversation is so important. And unfortunately, there's just a perfect storm of conditions that have both caused this shortage of supply, but have also caused this shortage of sort of this gap in the types of housing that households are really looking for. And first and foremost, whenever we're doing work in a city or with a developer, it's always important to step aside and stop. Don't first and foremost talk about the product type or the type of housing, but first start thinking about who is it that we are delivering this housing for? What's the household composition? What are their actual needs related to the housing that we need to be delivering? And just these statistics always sort of wake people up a little bit. So in every market, and this is growing, nearly 30%, in some markets a little more than 30% of households are one person. And do you think that 30% of the housing stock that exists and 30% of the housing stock that we're building is sort of designed and built to the specific needs of a single person household, right? Absolutely not. So that's part of the gap that we need to be thinking about. Secondarily, 75 to 85% of households in the next couple of years will be households without children, right? And so it's important to deliver housing for households that are composed with multiple children, but what the statistics and the data is showing is that we really need to be delivering more housing to the specific needs of these households without children and cater to the needs of those households as well. Thirdly, by 2030, 1 out of every 5 people in the US will be over the age of 65. So are we designing and building homes to meet the specific needs of that rapidly aging population? So we need to be thinking about that. And this is one of the primary reasons that AARP National and also AARP Kentucky, I'm not sure if any of the AARP Kentucky folks are here today, have become some of the biggest champions of the missing middle housing. And we did this free downloadable online report on missing middle housing with AARP National a couple years ago, and it's a great online resource to help inform this conversation, right? And then there's this growing affordability crisis, right? And I just pulled some of this data as I was talking with Wendy in preparation for this, attending this conference is, right, you've got like 40% of Kentucky renters were housing cost burdened, right? That's extreme. And that means they're spending more than 30% of their annual income on just housing. And so we need to be thinking about that. And so what we have found is that it's become nearly impossible to build and deliver single-family detached houses at price points that are attainable for entry-level buyers and for any households that have sort of medium and to lower incomes. And so we're actually working with developers all across the country to re-entitle subdivisions that were entitled for all single family to include a mix of these missing middle typologies. And so we need to be thinking about that as well, as like what are some of the solutions that will help address that. And on top of that dramatic shift in household composition that's been happening over the last couple of decades is AARP just released their preference survey. They do it, I think, every 2 years. And over half of American households would choose to live in non-single family detached houses if there was walkability to amenities like a coffee shop or a cafe or a bookstore. And so for the very first time, over half of American households are saying this is what we want, but only 8% of the entire US geography delivers that kind of living. And so there's a gap there as well. And I also want to mention that the average cost of owning a car per year is almost $11,000. So you think about these households that are housing cost burdened, and you also need to add on top of that is I'm sure they're having to drive every day to work. So you can include the cost of 2 cars, or 3 cars on top of that, and it makes that sort of burden even more extreme that we need to be addressing. Okay, and then the other thing is our zoning is an out-of-date operating system, and this is where a lot of our work comes into play with cities, is this camera was created the same year that Euclidean zoning the operating system was established. Can you think of any other operating system that's over 100 years old that we're still trying to use today? And that's part of why zoning has failed and is failing to deliver. It's providing barriers for the delivery of these broader choices in rural communities, medium-sized communities, and large cities. I kept hearing over and over in the sessions this morning, this just isn't a big city or a metro problem. This goes down to the smallest and the most rural communities where a lot of our work is even in those rural communities all across the country in all different regions. So what is missing middle housing and why is it important? So first of all, the middle, somebody asked me this morning, where did middle come from? First of all, the middle relates to the form and scale of these buildings, where they're very compatible scale with the single family home. And so this is the missing middle diagram that we created about 12 years ago that seems to make it into a lot of statewide policy now, local planning documents. It's really informed the conversation in a great way. So For us, missing middle housing is house-scale buildings with multiple units, most in walkable neighborhoods. And so this house scale is key to building support in your communities, because you're adding more units to a building doesn't mean it's going to be this big out-of-scale building that's landing in a neighborhood. And you'll see this based on the examples that I'll show you here in just a little bit. So, for example, this building here is a triplex. But you wouldn't actually know if you were driving by this, walking by this, riding your bike by this, because it looks and behaves like a single-family detached house. And that's a really important part of this concept. And historically, up until the 1940s, when zoning was put in place, we actually built neighborhoods and they just mixed all these types together because they were the similar scale, and it worked out just fine. So this is a really, really important concept. And then secondarily, the middle relates to the ability to deliver affordability by design, or what we often call attainability, for middle-income households. And where that threshold hits varies market to market, but it's usually about 80% of median income and above can afford these missing middle types if they're delivered thoughtfully. And so this is the barbell, the affordable housing barbell that we created, where, right, there's a need to increase supply to address the affordability issue, which is the focus of the GAP study. We also need to be thinking about, on the left-hand side, we need subsidized housing to deliver to sort of the medium and lower income families, super important. And the missing middle just kind of fits nicely in between as a way where, because they're easy to build, because they're efficient and deliver multiple units, they can be delivered at just sort of without subsidies at middle sort of income affordable prices. And so that's really, really important. That's where it fits into the conversation here. Now, there are exceptions to this. In my book, a lot of the case studies are market-driven examples, but there's also a few examples like this one in New Orleans, where the developer partnered with the New Orleans Housing Authority to renovate, I think it's up to 50 little missing middle duplexes that were in a real state of disrepair, and deliver them to residents that were returning from the hurricane recovery. So there are really creative ways that developers are also using these in a more affordable housing approach with the subsidies that come along with that. So why do we call it missing? I do need to update this graph, but you see less than 10% of all units produced between 1990 and 2013 were missing middle scale, which we say are 18 units and below in a building. And if I added 2013 to 2024 on this, it would dive even sharper, unfortunately, because I have seen that data. So secondarily, I wanted to walk through and show you some visualizations of a range of these types. And I think it's really important for all of us to be able to go into communities and to be able to talk about these housing types in a way that is approachable and frames the conversation effectively as like a lexicon or vocabulary we can all share as we have these missing middle conversations. The first one, these are pretty straightforward, starting out with a side-by-side duplex, right? That's pretty straightforward typology. These were built historically in a lot of neighborhoods. I want to say that when we launched missingmiddlehousing.com as a free online resource, this was in 2016, I think, we provided 20 years of data on the analysis of these typologies that we included in these tables. And we want this to inform people's conversations about planning, zoning, policy, future land use. So that's all available for free at missingmiddlehousing.com for each one of these typologies. There's a duplex stacked, right? Go in one door on the right and there's a ground floor unit. The door on the left goes up a private entry to the unit above. I go by this building every day on my way into work, and it sits on a street that's about 90% single-family detached houses, and you would never know, based on the scale of it and the way that it responds to the street, that it has multiple units in it. And then that cottage court example that I showed you, that was in Greenwich, Rhode Island. And it's just a series of really small cottages, let me go to this next slide, ranging from size to 855 square feet to 1,000 square feet around a shared community green space. And like I said, this it's on just a little less than an acre. And that's a site that's walking distance to the small downtown of Greenwich, Rhode Island. It's a really great type of opportunity site for missing middle. I think townhouses are a pretty straightforward typology as well. Right, there's a great history, especially in this region, of great townhouse examples. We worked with a developer who was having problems, this was the Salt Lake City market, delivering a 3-story tuck-under townhouse type at an entry-level price point. And he said, can we use missing middle thinking and typologies to deliver more attainability? And so we designed this, we call the Muse Homes project, that they were able to deliver at a price point of about 30 grand less than their conventional townhouse product type. And so good design can help with creative solutions to delivering different ranges of attainability. The fourplex, which is my favorite, it's just 2 units on the ground floor, 2 units above, where you can see it's still house scale. This is actually an example in Louisville that we documented when we were doing work with the city of Louisville. Great typology. Then a few additions, because I know there's a need to discuss this, and there's people in the audience that are will be applying this to more rural contexts of like, also need to be thinking about really small lot, single family detached houses in some of these markets as part of your catalog. These houses are on a 35-foot by 90-foot lot. They have a lane in the back where the parking is. And right, I can guarantee you that probably 80% of zoning codes in cities across Kentucky don't allow a single family home on a lot that small. Maybe even up to 90+% of city zoning codes. So this would be a good test for you to open up, have your planning staff open up your zoning code and take a look at it. Then there's small cottages. And these are usually sub 700 square feet, really great typology, and they're usually clustered on a smaller lot. And once again, there's a lot of barriers in place. I actually proposed developing this little cluster of cottages in a small town in Nebraska where I grew up, because they were giving lots away, and it didn't meet their zoning code in about 3 or 4 different ways, and they were unable to sort of figure out a way to navigate this. And this is a place where town of 2,500 people, the teachers can't afford to rent or buy in their community, and this would have been a perfect home for a single person household that's teaching, or maybe a fireman or a police officer. So got to be thinking about how to accommodate those. And then accessory dwelling units, right? That small apartment above the garage, or maybe the garage, part of the garage converted into accessory dwelling unit. I think this is a really great place to start. If you're gonna, this is probably the lowest hanging fruit, is to enable these types in your communities, but it's really important to not require off-street parking for them, otherwise they won't typically make sense economically or geographically, will be constrained. So characteristics, smaller but well-designed units. This is really, really important part of this, is that we're not talking about micro units, like we're not talking about 300, 400 square foot units. We're usually talking about 650 to 1,200 square feet, really thoughtfully designed. And just to give you an example, my great-grandmother, when I was growing up, lived in a duplex, and her unit was probably about 650, I don't know, I would guess this, this was years ago, but I would approximate it was a small 1-bedroom. Everything she needed sort of at that point of her life, and it was enough space for her to have a world-class bakery in her kitchen, right? I can remember the smells of that. But it delivered everything she needed at that point of her life, and it takes really thoughtful design to make sure that those smaller units are livable. And here, there are some like built-in nooks, good natural light, maybe slightly taller ceilings to give the volume a little bit more. And so we're often doing this in our architecture projects with developers, just being really creative about how we can make small livable, not small in a place that nobody really wants to live. Like, that's not the point here. A lot of these types are typically parked off of an alley or a lane. right? And this is new construction and infill. And part of the challenge is we work in a lot of communities that had historically had alleys, but they stopped maintaining them. But when you start getting this compact with the development to make it financially feasible, a lot of times it makes more sense to have the parking off of the alley. So it's just something for you to be thinking about and discussing in your communities, because it's an important part of how a lot of these missing middle types function. Okay, then there's the loaded conversation about parking. And we're not assuming people are not going to own cars. And we're not assuming everybody's going to use transit or that there's transit available. We're just saying, as generally speaking, we suggest removing parking requirements and letting the market determine the amount of parking that's delivered. And also thinking creatively about allowing on-street parking, because what we've found in most markets is if you're requiring more than one off-street parking space per unit, it's either physically not possible to fit like a fourplex on an existing lot, or it's not economically feasible to develop it on a new lot because the lot gets too big. And I know this is a really, the ARP publication, The Missing Middle, it's got a really great section on how to start a effective conversation about parking, and I think this is really, really important because you will not get missing middle housing if you don't fix your parking regulations, period. Like, you can't be for missing middle and affordability, but still requiring high parking requirements. So I'll just say that. And so we've actually sort of been able to document how much additional cost parking spaces add to development. That's a really good analysis piece that you can do, and you're specific to your region. It's really important, right? If you think about like a detached garage costs at least $15,000, $20,000, maybe now $25,000 to build. Like, if you add that to the cost of the home, that immediately puts a whole range of households, sort of makes that house too expensive. Townhouse, fourplex. So just be thinking about that way. We designed this project for a developer in the Omaha, Nebraska metro, in a small town in the Omaha metro. It's all multiplexes. The number represents the number of units in each building. There's a suburban location, edge of the city, no transit, and it's parked at one parking space per unit, and it snows and gets miserable in Nebraska in the winter. I grew up there, so I can attest to that. But it functions completely well. It gave the developer the efficiencies he needed, and actually it's now outperforming every other apartment project in that region. So where should you be thinking about applying missing middle? Right, it's happened in a lot of different patterns. And I think what I said earlier, I just want to reinforce, is historically, we had streets and blocks that had a mix of missing middle types, duplexes, triplex, fourplex, and single family homes, cottage courts, all on the same block. It wasn't like this, the townhouses are over here, the cottage courts are over here, single family, big single family, it's like all mixed together. And I think that's part of the real strategy. And I think the first place to look, and this is regardless of size of your community, are small individual infill lots, because there's always opportunities. And downtown adjacent, I feel, is the low-hanging fruit. And downtown might be 3 buildings, right? It might be 2 buildings at an intersection, or it might be several blocks of your historic downtown is a great location. And I randomly got onto Google Maps, and I just grabbed, this was Owensboro. I don't know much about it, but I went in and explored it a little bit, and I can immediately, in almost any Google map I go to, find opportunities within sort of a block or two of the main street where missing middle would be a great infill case study. So that's one type. And the second type is, how many of you have underutilized commercial lots, vacant strip malls, light industrial buildings that are sitting empty, sort of blighted? Like, these are great sites to transform into missing middle communities. And so this was a site in a small town called Modesto in California, and we did a missing middle strategy for them and illustrated that if they changed their zoning code to allow this, that we ran pro forma analysis that this is the missing middle that the developer could deliver with some small commercial flex space along the busy corridor and then transitioning into these multiplexes. And most communities have these opportunities, right? They're not hard to find. I can find them on my Google Maps. The third area is new growth areas, right? Not every city's growing at the edge, but a lot of cities are growing at the edge. And so this is an example. We worked with Iowa City, Iowa. They identified an area at the fringe of their town and said, we want to ensure that missing middle gets delivered here. And so we did a plan and wrote a new form-based zoning code to enable the missing middle housing in that new growth area. It could be 10 acres, 20 acres, it could be 200, 300, 400 acres. You could do whatever scale makes sense for your community. Now, this was a super interesting example. Is there anybody here from Custer? Who knows Custer? It's a really rural community that I found on the map. And what I like about this is, right, there's a little crossroads with a couple commercial buildings. And then on the upper portion, there's an elementary school kind of stranded out in the middle of nowhere. And this is a great opportunity. This would be a great place to develop a missing middle neighborhood to tie that commercial node into the elementary school and give people some walkability to those services and to that school as well. And so this is that same neighborhood in Nebraska. This would be a great sort of pattern of missing middle development. This is a 40-acre community delivering about 742 units of missing middle. It's about 400 units completed and occupied, and another 300 plus under construction. And Omaha's not a rapidly growing market, right? It's not like a Charlotte or a Portland. But the project's performing super well. So some thoughts and ideas about how to apply missing middle based on some lessons learned. Back to this dated camera, right? The operating system is outdated, and what we really need is the new operating system, right, to help us deliver housing. So you need to have these conversations in your communities to sort of what is that new operating system, and here are some of the ways that we're working with cities, counties, and now states to enable missing middle housing through policy, planning, and zoning. It's important to note that we call this the missing middle sweet spot, and it's feasibility is key. And so we always work with an economist or a developer to run pro forma analysis on what it is we're proposing on existing lots to make sure we're not proposing something that doesn't make sense for a developer. Secondarily, it's attainability, is like making sure that what we're delivering also delivers at price points where the target wants to be. And third of all is livability, because we're not just delivering housing for housing's sake. Like, we want this to be very desirable, livable housing choices. So we created this, we realized that historically we got caught up working with one city over the course of like 4 or 5 or 6 years on one project. And we realized that with our missing middle expertise, we needed to figure out a way to kind of jump into a city, spend 3 to 4 months working with that city, provide a set of really specific recommendations, and then let the city implement those changes and bring us back in only as needed. And so we created this process called the missing middle scan and the missing middle deep dive. And we've done this for cities of various sizes all across the country, where we come in and we identify where the city should prioritize missing middle application. We assess the comprehensive plan, zoning, maps, and any other plans they have in place, and sort of make specific changes, recommended changes. And then they have that as a tool as part of their missing middle strategy. And so what I would say is at 2:15 today, we're going to do a deep dive in the planning and zoning aspect of this with my colleague Roger. And so if you're interested in that aspect of this, come to our session at 2:15 to do that, more of that deep dive into the planning and zoning piece of this. So we've been working with the city of Louisville. It's been exciting. I don't know how many of you might know Emily Liu, the unfortunately now former planning director, but we first started with a zoning code diagnosis, but more recently started with this mixed use and housing priority map, which we're really excited about. We'll talk more about that this afternoon as well. And then, thinking about how can the public sector step up and help with the delivery of these missing middle housing types. And we're working with the City of Tucson's Economic Development Department to identify city-owned sites that would be good opportunities for missing middle, and actually visualizing what that would be, and then they'll use this to go out to an RFP for developers to implement this specific vision. And then we worked with the city of South Bend, Indiana. This is one of the first applications to do a package of pre-approved housing plans. And Jennifer Settle from our office worked with South Bend to deliver this, and this is a really growing trend. If you're interested in this, you can Google the topic and my name, and I recently wrote an article on this of tips for approaching this pre-approved housing plans. I think this is really the future. And then what we also realized is that we really needed regional solutions. Like for every individual jurisdiction in a state or a region to have to go into their comprehensive plan, go into their zoning code, will take years, and a lot of those cities don't have the staff, and they don't have the funding to do that. So we were thinking about how can we have an impact at a regional scale. So we were hired recently by the Washington State Department of Commerce to do a regional missing middle shared zoning toolkit for the entire Puget Sound region. And this can be applied potentially to over 100 different jurisdictions, 82 jurisdictions, and it's not being required, it's sort of being provided to them as a resource to help each individual jurisdiction implement this. And so there's educational resources. We did posters, we did webinars, we did graphics illustrating what a before and after might look like for a street that's all single family to have missing middle in it. And then we did this shared zoning toolkit that can just be slid directly into their existing zoning as an easy way to spread more broadly. Encourage you to look at the state of Michigan's missing middle strategies. They've been using missing middle now for almost 10 years, doing some really creative work on that front too, if you're interested. And a few concluding thoughts. I am a zoning geek, zoning and housing geek, right? Like I think about this all the time. This is what happens when I'm playing Monopoly with my 14-year-old son. I realize that even Monopoly's missing the missing middle housing, right? Just like you all who are really committed to sort of thinking creatively about and being part of the solution. And so I do feel that modular is a necessary part of the solution as well, because we just don't have enough builders. And we've been working with a company called Fading West based in Buena Vista, Colorado, that are delivering workforce housing, mostly for like the ski resort communities, and small lot single family and townhouses, and we're really hoping to expand that to more of the multiplexes in the short term. So think about this as a hack. If you want to think of what can I go back to my city and like have a little hack, is if every city counted in their planning and their zoning allowed densities, every unit under, I don't know, it could be, you can flex 850 square feet counts as half a unit in your allowed number of units, in your parking requirements, if you have impact fees or development fees. That would actually be a really interesting first step to sort of allowing some of this to happen in your communities more readily by right. Chris Nelson wrote, he's one of the nation's experts on market demand and household composition, wrote a chapter in my book. And he found in his study, in preparation for writing that chapter, that 62% of homes built between now and 2040 would have to be missing middle housing types to meet the need and demand. So that's pretty staggering. I don't think we're immediately going to shift our delivery systems and allow that, but that just shows the extent of the gap. I do have a table in the exhibit space. I'm selling books. I'm also happy I'm going to be there the rest of this afternoon and tomorrow morning, happy to answer questions you have. If you're active on LinkedIn, reach out. I usually do about a post a week. It's usually missing middle, but sometimes it's related to some other things. Feel free to drop by and just pick my brain about missing middle. I'm always happy to hear what other people are up to, what solutions they're delivering. And I love this I love to end with this, this quote from a publication called What's Next by Urban Lands Institute. It's time to rethink and evolve and reinvent and renew. And I think this is really like, it's the call to arms. And I think I heard this several times today. It's going to take every single one of us in the room, whether you're a developer, an economist, a community member, a decision maker, an architect. It's going to take all of us to come to the table to be part of the solution and to really make a dent in both the gap in the supply, but also the gap in these types of housing that have been missing from our housing delivery systems. So I want to thank you for all already stepping up to be part of the solution, and I encourage you to sort of take this information and become missing middle champions in your communities. Thank you.